Yes, you have your calculators. Yes, you can just type that in. But your calculators are not going to give you those 5 critical points that you need the most. So for example, on this first one, this is a positive sign graph. You need to be able to tell me what the coordinates are for that point, that point, that point, that point, and that point. And I'll tell you what, your calculator is not going to do that for you. Okay? So you need to understand how to do this yourself. So first of all, I tend to like to start with the midline and come up with what my range is for my max and my min, because scaling the y-axis is easier. So my midline is 1. What's my max going to be? 3, because my amplitude was 2. So I'm going to start at 1 as my midline. I go 2 above, and 2 below will put me where? -1. Now this one doesn't give us any axes to work on. I'm going to keep my y-axis all the way to the left and just graph the positive section of this. And since I have to go as low as -1 and as high as 3, I'm going to maybe put my x-axis right around here. And I'll count by 1. So here's 1, 2, 3, and here's -1. Now the x-axis scaling is the hardest, okay? The good news is we have no phase shift. Phase shifts make things a little bit tricky, but we have no phase shift right now, so whatever we're starting at 0, and so our period is going to end wherever P is. So period equals 2 pi over B, and that is 2 pi over, Natalie, what's our B value? Nope, that's our amplitude. This is A sine BX plus C. So what's our B value? 1/2. So 2 pi divided by 1/2. If you're dividing by a fraction, you keep, change, and flip. 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi. So here's what I was saying. When it comes to scaling, take your period and divide it into 4 parts. What is 4 pi divided by 4? Just pi. That's what you should count by. So count by your period divided into 4 parts. And in this case, that would be 4 pi divided by 4 parts, and that would be pi. So I don't have to count every unit by pi. Maybe I do every 2 units. So I call this pi. That'd be 1 pi. This would be 2 pi. This would be 3 pi. And this would be 4 pi. And now I can start to graph, get my midline on there. That's at 1. And then start with your critical point. So we're starting on the midline here. We're ending, I'll put a little X through that because we graphed that. We're ending on the midline at 4 pi. And halfway in between there, we hit the midline again. That's happening at 2 pi. And then halfway between those first 2 midline values, we're going to hit our maximum, so that'll be at 1 pi. We hit our maximum of 3. And then halfway between 2 and 4 pi, which is an easy 3 pi, we hit our minimum of -1. And there's your graph. So if someone were to ask you to label these 4 points, it would be 0, 1, pi, comma 3, 2 pi, comma 1, 3 pi, comma -1, and 4 pi, comma 1. Okie doke. Any questions? Okay. Jump down to 3. 3 gets tricky. Okay, our format is this. A cosine B parentheses x minus c plus d. Here's the first tricky part. your parentheses have to start with x. This parenthesis does not start with x, it's starting with a half of an x. We have to factor out that number. So we have to pull out a 1/2 in front of the set of parentheses so that it's x minus, and what is 1 pi divided by a half? What's 1 pi when I divide out a half? 2 pi. I have to keep, change, flip. It's going to be 2 pi. So that's tricky. Having to factor something out there is tricky. But without that, you guys don't know appropriately what your C value is. You don't know your C value and what your phase shift is until that number's been factored out. So when we don't have a phase shift, our cycle starts at 0 and ends at the end of the period, right? But when we have a phase shift, our cycle isn't starting at 0 anymore. Our cycle is starting where? This has been shifted how many units and in which direction? 2 pi to the right. So we're starting our cycle at 2 pi. And it's going to end a period later. So it's going to end at whatever a full period later is. We have yet to calculate the period, so let's do that. Period equals 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi over, what's our b here? A half. What's 2 pi divided by a half? 4 pi. So our period is 4 pi units long, which means if we're starting at 2 pi and we're ending 4 pi units later, where are we ending? 6 pi. So this positive cosine graph is starting at 2 pi and ending at 6 pi. The good news is our period is still nicely divisible by 4, yes? We can count by pi. So I'm going to put on my y-axis again. And my midline's actually at -2, so since that's a negative number, I'm going to put my x-axis right up here because my midline's got to be down here. But my cycle is not starting until, and I'm going to count by pi, so here's pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, 6 pi. Okay, so my positive cosine cycle is starting here on the 2 pi line. And it's starting at a maximum. What is the maximum here? If the midline is -2 and the amplitude is 3, the maximum is 1. And what's the minimum? -5. Well, I might struggle to fit that. I might not have done it, but we'll get there. So I'm starting my cycle at x equals 2 pi. I'll put x equals 2 pi so you can see that. And it's at a maximum of 1. It's ending at 6 pi, also at a maximum of 1. How many units are between my 2 pi and 6 pi? 4. So I can easily cut that in half and get halfway in between at 2, right? And that's where I'm going to hit my minimum of -5. -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So yeah, I'm slightly off the graph, but we'll live. And then halfway between these 2 points, I mean horizontally, there's 2 units between them. So if I go 1 unit between, that's when I'm going to hit the midline. And same thing over here. That's when I'm going to hit the midline. So our graph looks like this. Now, typically, that's a weird stretch to see. Even though that's where our cycle started and ended due to the phase shift, we can still trace this pattern back to get to the y-axis. So this was 1 unit over and 3 down. So I'm going to go 1 unit over and 3 down to get here. And then this was 3 units down and 1 over still, so I'm going 1, 2, 3 units down and 1 over still to get the rest of the graph. And then certainly you can use your calculator to check that, to see that it hits the y-axis at a negative number. Okay, your homework is just the back. Well, no, I take that back. I want you to do 2, 4, do 2, 4, Morgan, how are you going to remember this? 2, 4, 6, and 8. There, I made your life easier, Morgan. Evens, 2, 4, 6, and 8.